early on, there were far fewer homeschoolers, and the legal battles were a lot bigger in the sense that, they were actually prosecuting people for the simple act of homeschooling because they didn't have a teacher's license. And as those battles were won and the legality of homeschooling became, less of an issue, there's something like 12,000-ish school districts in America, and each one of those weirdly has a superintendent, and they have a whole bureaucracy. And issues just crop up all the time. One of the great things about working here is very little time goes by, but what somebody, Kevin or somebody else will come into my office and give me a fact pattern, and I'm like, I never would have come up with that. It's like somebody's trying to write a law school exam question and they're making stuff up.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program.
Thanks everyone for joining us on Homeschool Talks. I'm Kevin Boden, and today I will be interviewing your host, Jim Madison, the current president of HSLDA. When I joined, he was an attorney here and the vice president for litigation, and he has been involved in many, many cases over the years that have been seminal to homeschool freedom and the advancement of the cause in America today. And so we're going to talk about some of those cases, the different types of cases that he's worked on and how those have impacted the movement. And I think you'll be encouraged and maybe a little bit surprised at the fight that continues even to this day. So Jim, let's start with some VA type cases that we've worked on. There's a particular case from 2004 that was quite critical and kind of launched us into that sphere. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So the Veterans Administration, along with a lot of other benefit granting federal organizations like Social Security Administration and so forth, if you're a veteran and you qualify for benefits, you get additional money if you have children. And most of these laws were written kind of in the pre-homeschooling era, but they will say something like, you get additional benefits for your children as long as they stay in school. But they'll cut off at 18 when your child turns age 18, unless the child is still continuing their secondary education. And so what the VA did when I first came to work here was their particular statute said, as long as the child is enrolled in a state-approved educational institution, you could continue receiving benefits for that child. And the Veterans Administration took the position that lawful homeschooling in the state of Wisconsin was not a state-approved educational institution. So one of our missions here at HSLDA has always been to kind of roll back discriminatory laws that end up treating people who are, legitimately pursuing education through homeschooling differently from people who send their kids to public school, for example. So if this particular family had been sending their kids to the public school, they would have got a verification from the school that the kid was still enrolled, and the benefits would have continued without interruption. But because they homeschooled, the VA took the position that the kid wasn't enrolled in a valid educational institution, and they cut off his benefits. And so we objected to that and started an appeal through the administrative agency. Along the way, learned some interesting things. And so this whole thing started because the Veterans Administration General Counsel wrote a memo saying that homeschooling didn't count as an educational institution. And that General Counsel memo then went through, was distributed to all, I can't remember the exact number, but 12 or 13 Veterans Administration regional offices. And so, we got pretty deeply enmeshed in the Veterans Administration bureaucracy. And the appeals process was sort of already underway when I came to work here. but it made its way to a thing, and there is such a thing. This is a real thing. It's hard to believe, but there is a court of appeals for veterans.
Interesting.
It's an actual court of appeals for...
It's administrative court in nature.
It's an administrative court in nature.
Okay.
And so the reason you asked that question, it's a good reason. In the Constitution, there are Article 3 courts, which are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and they have lifetime tenure. But there are Article 1 courts as well, which are kind of actually part of the executive branch. They serve, terms. They can get fired for different reasons. But so this was an Article 1 administrative court, but it was treated very much like a court. So we had to go, through the regional general counsel who pointed to the general counsel's opinion. Then we had to go to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is an administrative agency, and they pointed to the general counsel's opinion. And eventually we appealed it to the Court of Veterans' Appeals in Washington, D.C. And this is a little bit of an inside baseball thing, and I'm sure that our editors, they will probably cut this part. But it's fascinating.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
So I have been to many courts of appeal, and they're all kind of the same, fancy or not fancy. But you come in, there's a bunch of lawyers waiting around for their case to be argued, and there's a nice bench, and it has 3 chairs, and it has the judges' names. But so this time, I went to the Court of Veterans' Appeals in downtown Washington, D.C., and I had never been there. I didn't know where it was, and traffic and all that stuff. So I got there really early. And I show up, and the clerk for the Veterans Court of Appeals is very proud of this building. And he's showing me around. He takes me into the judge's chambers, and he takes me out into the courtroom, and it's really cool and very lavish, considering that I'd never even heard of it before. And he said, and so this case, we almost never actually have oral argument. We have all these facilities, these great facilities. We have cameras and we have microphones. But this case was so interesting that they decided to have actually have oral argument. So you're going to have oral argument. And they arranged this oral argument for the day when all of the general counsels from all of the 12 or 13 regions of the country are here for a meeting. So they're going to be sitting out there in the gallery watching oral argument. And it's going to be piped through our closed circuit TV program or technology throughout the country to every VA office that gets it. They can listen to it on their phone. They can watch it. So no pressure.
Well, maybe they thought they were going to win.
Well,
that's why they piped it everywhere.
It was just, this is something that happens a lot. Our homeschool cases that get to that level of court are often sort of out of the ordinary and are interesting. We had another case, just as an aside, in Vermont, where they scheduled our oral argument for the one day that they hold court at a law school in a big auditorium because they expect a lot of people to come. We've had several like that. Well, anyway, so we take these cases on because of, we think that homeschooling is a valid educational institution and that parents who are otherwise eligible for benefits shouldn't be discriminated against. And at this oral argument, it was a pretty hot panel, as frequently happens when people they know they're on camera. Yep. And I kind of walked out of the oral argument thinking I did okay. And part of the reason I thought I did okay was one of the judges kind of took over the argument on my side, which happens sometimes on appellate panels. And he pulled out there's several legal dictionaries. And I think we'd briefed this, but he actually brought the legal dictionary and he has it on, up at the bench, and he opens it up and he reads the legal definition of this one. I went through like 10 legal dictionaries, and one of them actually defined educational institution as a phrase. And it was like any place where kids are taught. It was really, it was perfect. Anyway, so here's this big dramatic thing. I leave. And, all these general counsels are in the gallery, and after it's over and the judges leave, they're all up like shaking my hand, and, and it's like, that was really interesting. You're going to lose, but that was really interesting. I mean, we're solid on this, but you're going to lose, and great job. And so then I go down to the clerk's office a couple floors down because I had to drop something off. And the clerk's office, the people all stop what they're doing. They all look at me and they go, "Way to go, counselor," because they're all like worker bees, and they're tuning in on, we're standing up for the little guy. So it turned out fine. I mean, we won both. I think we won on the technicality and on the merits, which then changed the course of a bunch of other cases that we had in various stages in the administrative process. I think we had a couple more that we took all the way to the Board of Immigration Appeals. But now we have this precedent that, established clearly that, homeschooling is a valid educational institution. But the problem for us as homeschoolers is that every state has a different way of saying that. And some states don't have any way of saying that. So the different cases would percolate up, and they would be taken a little bit too far in my view, but they would always come up against that opinion from 2004. And, we still get them once in a while, but for the most part, that one case solved the problem for everyone.
So what's been to fast forward to today, why would a homeschool family today be interested to know that this went on nearly 20 years ago? I mean, what's the impact from homeschool freedom that still reverberates today?
Yeah. So, it's different today. Our mission for a long time was, to roll back barriers. Homeschooling was illegal in a lot of places and thought to be illegal in a lot of places and disfavored almost everywhere else and treated as kind of a fringe, disfavored approach to education. Much of that's changed, right? But we still have agencies and individuals in different bureaucracies who, for whatever reason, come up with, this is not going to happen on my watch. They think they know better.
Yeah, it's certainly the case where one would think that being lawful in all 50 states across the nation, that the discrimination would have ceased. But as we'll talk about, the reality is discrimination is alive and well. And sometimes it's systemic, sometimes, like in the case of the VA, sometimes it's just in particular family, a particular district or social worker. So I know we're involved in Social Security Administration cases. Tell us a little bit about why these cases are important and kind of what these cases are about. My guess is it's probably less familiar to most of our audience. So what is a case about Social Security Administration? And then we'll get into the details of one.
Well, the Social Security Administration, it's very similar to the VA cases, but it involves a lot more people. So if you're eligible to receive Social Security benefits because your spouse died or is disabled, the same rule applies, that you get extra money to help support your children as long as they stay in school. And if they, after they turn 18, they have to still be in high school. The difference here is, and again, when I came here in 2001, what we didn't have very many of these, but they would come in occasionally. And the first one that I personally was involved in, it's unremarkable. It wasn't that big of a deal, but what I discovered was that the Social Security Administration itself had a whole manual on how to handle homeschoolers. And, it was fairly new. We didn't really know much about it. And they had a general rule that applied that said, basically, if the child is enrolled in a homeschool program that is legal under state law, treat them as a student after they turn 18. And as separate individual cases would come up through the administration, they had in this manual, they would have state by state, and they'd review it, the particular circumstances against state law. And they'd say, well, according to this state's law, the homeschooler has to turn in a notice of intent and, assessments at the end of the year. And that's how you evaluate it. And they were doing it really well. The problem was the local offices all over the country it was kind of like, well, we don't believe in homeschooling around these here parts. And they would tell families, these are, generally speaking, families whose father has died or is disabled, or mother is, and so they're in need of the money for them. They really need the money in these federal benefits, and they can't afford lawyers. And so when they go to the local office and the local person says, sorry, you don't qualify, they had no recourse. They really didn't know what to do. And so these homeschool families in need would call us. And then we figured out how, the administration at the top level, unlike the VA, had already figured it out correctly. But at the lower levels, the word just never got out. And so we did a bunch of cases, and we sued the Social Security Administration a couple of times, and eventually, got it all sorted out. And so I don't really, we do an article in our court report periodically every year or two. We've helped dozens and dozens and dozens of families to recover hundreds of thousands of dollars of benefits that they should have had. It's always a great moment when one of these things crops up. Sometimes it's complicated. It's a complicated procedure. And so we're like experts at it now. And sometimes the families may make a mistake. They may miss a deadline, or, they didn't put all the right information in, and they didn't talk to us first or whatever. And then we go back and sort it out. Sometimes it's still the old, local office just doesn't, they just either don't understand it, they disfavor homeschooling, whatever. But we get a letter from the administration, Social Security Administration, saying we're reinstating $10,000 of benefits to this family. And, so that's just a thing that we decided to take on because those people need help, and we know how to do it. And we know better than anybody else how the homeschooling laws of each state works. And so that's how we got into it, and that's what we do.
I mean, it sounds pretty rewarding, and there's real tangible benefit to the family. I mean, it's real impact, from a daily perspective. It's food on the table, it's homeschool curriculum, it's all of the things the families need. The right to homeschool is great on paper in statute, but we also need that right to be, enforced rightly by the people that hold some sway one way or the other. So it's kind of like, what good is a right written down if you can't practice that right, every day? And so I think the VA cases and the Social Security Administration cases represent that we're not just committed to legislation on paper, but committed to fighting for that, for the families. And so it's pretty neat. All right. Social Security district cases. So we're going to get to the CPS cases last, because those are, when I think of HSLDA back in the 80s and 90s, I think of the family that joined because they were afraid of the knock on their door. And you hear the stories of the parents telling their kids, hey, here's who you call. Call the police, or you call HSLDA if you need help and we're not home and somebody's questioning your homeschool. So, but we to this day, we still have disagreements with school districts. We still have debates with them. We write letters to them regularly about policies, procedures, discriminatory practices, things they're asking for that they don't have a right to ask for, solicitations they're making, and all of these types of things. And we've been involved with these for, as long as you've been here. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I came 20 years in. So that's an important kind of distinction, because early on there were far fewer homeschoolers, and the legal battles were a lot bigger in the sense that, they were actually prosecuting people for the simple act of homeschooling because they didn't have a teacher's license. And as those battles were won and the legality of homeschooling became, less of an issue, there was still, there's something like 12,000-ish school districts in America, and each one of those weirdly has a superintendent, and they have a whole bureaucracy. And issues just crop up all the time. Some of them just bizarre issues that one of the great things about working here is very little time goes by, but what somebody, Kevin or somebody else will come into my office and give me a fact pattern, and I'll like, I never would have come up with that. It's like somebody's trying to write a law school exam question and they're making stuff up. And sure enough, it's true. That's really happened. And maybe we'll talk about one of those that happened right here in my home state of Virginia.
It happens pretty regularly in my experience. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, there was and I found often it's new superintendents. Superintendent comes in, they're not antagonistic, but they just are fairly ignorant of what the law actually says. And so in their quest to try to help, they start making all these demands of families, and it just doesn't work out well. One particularly problematic area is special education services. When a family wants to withdraw their child because they don't think they're getting the support in the public school that they need, they'll withdraw that child, and many families encounter resistance from the school officials. So comment on why you think it is that when a family goes to withdraw, in particular a special needs child, they encounter maybe a level of resistance that they may not if the child was not special needs.
Yeah. So this is sort of a general thing. When a child with special needs, if the parent thinks that the child has special needs, there's a federal law that is Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, and it's been amended a few times, and it has a new gobbledygook acronym. It used to have a pretty good acronym. You could actually say it, IDEA, but now it's got some other acronym. Anyway, that federal law is almost impossible to understand by anybody. Nobody gets it. And, you'll be shocked to learn that this federal law created this huge, enormous bureaucracy.
That is shocking.
It is shocking. I'm sorry to, burst your bubble, but that happened. And that bureaucracy has not just a big, complicated statute, but it takes up thousands of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations, which are administrative regulations promulgated by the Department of Education. And so when somebody thinks that their child has special needs, there's this whole big, long procedure that they have to go through. And sometimes it's really easy for some families, but I would say that it's probably the borderline cases where the parents feel strongly, but it's complicated. And the school, got to go through this whole assessment thing. And it's they got panels. I've been in some of these, they bring in like 20 people. I mean, it's amazing to decide these simple things. And so one of the cases that I worked on very early on was a family who was in that very position of trying to get their child services through the public school. And they just were beating their head up against the wall. And finally, the mom said, well, I've had enough. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to withdraw the child to homeschool. Well, so now the public school has two problems. I mean, one of them is, to answer your question, they have a sense of, investment in this child, even though they didn't do anything to help, but they've gone through this whole big process, right? So they know this family, they know this child. And there's sort of a, wait a minute, you can't leave now, we've spent all this time. And then the other was, in the case that I'm going to talk about next, solved this. But there was a problem. In this vast statute and regulatory scheme, there was a case that the Supreme Court handled that said this: school districts were required to find children with special needs in their district and offer them services, or at least offer them an evaluation. And so the Supreme Court said that if a school district fails in its duty to find a child, you could sue them, that you could sue the school district. If you left the school district, expended money to get the services that the school district was supposed to supply, and then later sued to get, to recover those. So it was called the child find provision. And in this case, the Fitzgerald family in Missouri tried for years to get their child services. When they couldn't and they withdrew, now the school district was worried that they would sue the school district for failing child find. So now all this time of of the family saying, I think my kid's got special needs. Won't you please evaluate him? Won't you please give him services? And them refusing. Once she moved out of the public school, they said, oh, no. We have to evaluate your child. And it was really purely, partly at least, to avoid child fine litigation. So the family had started homeschooling and they contacted us. And we said, this just really doesn't make a lot of sense. She didn't want services from the public school anymore. She'd had it. And all she wanted to do, to be was left alone. No more contact with the school district. So again, with this, huge volume of statutes and regulations, we had to go through an administrative hearing at which the administrative hearing officer said, well, whatever the school wants, they get, basically. Followed by a lawsuit. We sued the school district in the federal district court in Kansas City. And the federal district court basically said, well, whatever. We didn't even give us a hearing. We didn't even, no oral argument, nothing, just on papers. Whatever the school district wants, they get. Federal law says they have to find this child and you have to submit. And our argument, of course, was that this federal law is it's a spending clause law. And what it says is the federal government will give the public school money if you will enact certain procedures. And what the public school, the hearing officer, and the federal district court took that to mean is because we have this money, we now have authority over you, the parent, and you have to do what we tell you. But it was never an authority granting statute. It was you have to put these procedures in place to be eligible for the money. And nobody believed us or agreed with us until we went to the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. They were sitting in Kansas City, Missouri at the time. And I'll never forget this. I flew out on, the oral argument was on Columbus Day of whatever year the case was. Everything was closed. You couldn't get into the federal building because it was Columbus Day. And I was like knocking on the door. I got an argument. How do I get in here? And so unlike the Veterans Administration case that we talked about earlier, there was nobody there. There was nobody even in the building. It was just dead. It was crickets. And we made the argument. I made the argument. And a few months later, the Court of Appeals unanimously agreed with us, which was, great. You always like to win. But here's the thing. Parallel to all of this, there were all these other cases going on all over the country. People were bringing these kind of things to us. Especially once we started publicizing that this is a thing that we'll help you with. And our colleague, Darren Jones, was helping me in those years. What would happen is we figured out that the main motivation for the school districts in these cases was to avoid being sued. So we developed a waiver. So families would, sign the waiver, say, we won't sue you if you just leave us alone. And most of the time, school districts would accept that and leave us alone. But sometimes they wouldn't. So we had another case that where they refused to leave us alone that had already been through the hearing officer, and we'd already filed a lawsuit in the federal district court in New York. And so, but it wasn't completed yet. And so when that Court of Appeals case, now the Court of Appeals in Missouri is in the Eighth Circuit, New York's in the Second Circuit. So the Eighth Circuit doesn't get to boss around district courts in the Second Circuit, but it's very persuasive, right? So the federal district judge in New York said, well, that Eighth Circuit case is pretty persuasive and ruled in our favor. But wait, that's not all. While that was all happening, our federal relations department was working through the Department of Education itself to get a better regulation, to clarify in the Code of Federal Regulations that this sort of circumstance doesn't apply. If a family wants to leave the public school doesn't want an evaluation, you can't force them to get the evaluation against their will. And the Department of Education promulgated a kind of a wishy-washy rule that wasn't real clear. And it was kind of like they didn't, they kind of wanted to help, but they didn't want to, they were afraid that they couldn't get it through. And so then they held meetings, public meetings around the country in 6 different cities. And people came, and we unleashed the dogs, and people were writing, making comments, and thousands of people were, all of these different public meetings. And then the cases started coming in before the new regulation came out. So then the Department of Education, unasked really, just completely rewrote this wishy-washy regulation and just put it in black and white. That in these circumstances, you can't make them do what you want them. They're free to not do it. So, on all fronts, we worked on all fronts to get this problem resolved, and it's pretty much resolved once for all homeschoolers. It's now precedent in federal court and in black and white in the Code of Federal Regulations.
It's pretty common in my experience. I mean, even just last week, I got an email from a member in a state who had received a notification from a district offering them services, just saying, "Hey, we understand you're in our district. We're offering services." And what are your thoughts on that? Is it improper for the district to offer that? It's not a forcing; it's just an offer. What would you say?
Well, that's what they're required to do. So the federal child find statute requires them to seek out and find and offer, but they can't compel.
Yeah, and part of the challenge I've seen is these letters will often come with a date.
Yeah,
there's a date and a time, and they'll say, "Hey, we'd like to offer your services. Please show up at X date and time at this location." And the family, because they don't necessarily know how the law works or what's required, they read that as, "Oh my goodness, I'm compelled to show up for the services," and they reach out to us and we tell them what you said, which is they have a requirement to offer this. You can just ignore it unless you want services and show up. So it's something that impacts families today. What about if a school district is making more demands? What would you say to that family?
Well, the part of the work that you do, especially, and that we do and our legal department does, is provide the barrier between a demanding official and the homeschool family. So first and foremost, if you're a homeschool family and you get an unwelcome demand from a school district, you should contact us. There's a pretty good likelihood that if they're making an unlawful demand, that we can resolve it. And there's this rare occasion when there may be something more to it, and we can help you navigate that situation to try to resolve it the most favorable, the way you want it resolved. But I would be homeschoolers traditionally have been, and there's a lot of new homeschoolers today post-COVID that maybe need to learn this, but just be a little bit wary when you get kind of unexpected demands from a school official that they have a job and they think it's important and they want to do stuff and they don't necessarily support homeschooling. So they may not have your best interests at heart. So be skeptical.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I try to remind homeschool families too that, as you mentioned, the laws are complex. There's thousands of pages of regulations, and so the fact is that they may not understand it. No one really understands it, perfectly, and so give them a little bit of grace with like, hey, I understand you may not understand this. Once we explain it and make them aware, we would expect them to then follow it. But a little bit of grace to say, hey, let me educate you on what the law is. I have found that usually works. Is there a funding component here? I mean, would you say that my experience is, as we look at, the average cost per pupil in the school system, it's not uncommon knowledge that with a special needs child comes often significantly increased funding. And so do you think that factors into maybe some of the aggressive nature of some of the districts or officials with respect to special needs kids?
I don't. But the issue that most homeschooling families have that we work with is when they don't want services. And the school district is trying to, push them into something
so they stay.
that they don't want. Yeah. I don't know. I don't really know if there's a big funding component. My experience and sitting through, I don't know how many, but I've been to a lot of these meetings where, they have a social worker and a teacher and an administrator. And I've been at tables with 10, 12 people all trying to figure out one thing. And I think there's a genuine caring. They do care. But the bureaucracy that's been built up around it is just so cumbersome. Sometimes I don't even think they know how to get out of it. And they all frequently have sort of a paternalistic view of things that children should be in public school. We should try to keep these, people from the choice they want to make because their child will be better off in our care.
Yeah, and it's interesting, a lot of homeschool families that are withdrawing from public school are withdrawing precisely because they don't think they're getting the care that they need, the care that the district is telling them that they're actually going to provide or they are providing. So it's interesting how the perspectives of the two are often so different, and it's the same thing going on. So Jim, there's a fairly well-known case, the Sospeed case. Tell us about that case. What are the facts? What was at issue from a legal perspective in that case?
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about how school administrators can sometimes view the law in a different way than what you and I might view the law. And in Franklin County, Virginia, the school administrators, to their credit, realized that the Virginia statute didn't allow them to do what they wanted to do. And so they just passed their own law. The school board decided that homeschoolers should have to turn in additional information than what the state law required, and recognizing that state law didn't require it, they required it through a formal process at a school board meeting where a policy was introduced and voted on. And it said that homeschoolers now have to provide this additional information in these here pots because it couldn't apply statewide. It only happened, in this little section of Virginia, Franklin County, Roanoke, Virginia. So one of the great fun things about working here is just the serendipitous and ways that things come together. And, certain people of a certain age may remember the A-Team television show on TV. And one of the refrains on that show was, "Don't you love it when a plan comes together?" Well, in this case, what happened was a homeschool graduate named Kirk Sosby got married to a homeschool graduate named Kristen. Kirk attended Patrick Henry College, which is where you and I sit today, where our HSLDA offices are. Patrick Henry College, founded by HSLDA. He came here. He was a classmate of Peter Kamakabiba-Ole, who is now our director of litigation. And then he went to the University of Virginia Law School. He and Kristen got married. They had kids. He gets hired by pretty much the biggest, bestest law firm in Roanoke, and they have a child. Being a lawyer, he looked at the homeschool laws, and when his child became when they started to homeschool and the child became of age, they meticulously followed the state's homeschool laws. And they got a letter back from this school district and said, "Well, Mr. Sosby, we're so sorry, but we've added to the law and you need to provide this stuff." And being a lawyer, and his dad was in the Air Force, which you'll appreciate, moved around, but not likely to just do what somebody tells him to do if he didn't think it was right to do. So he wrote a letter back and said, I've read the law and it doesn't require me to do this. So, in much more kind and gracious way, he basically told him to buzz off. They referred it to their lawyer, who was instrumental in getting the policy passed. And their lawyer wrote him a letter and said, "Well, sadly, we're not going to buzz off. And in fact, if you don't provide us what we want, we're going to prosecute you.
But this is the school board attorney. He's not a prosecutor.
It's a school board attorney.
Okay.
Correct. He was the school board attorney who was instrumental in getting the policy passed, and he thought it was a good idea. Obviously, he probably wrote it. So Kirk called his old buddy Peter Kamakaviva Ole, who was now working at HSLDA, and we, HSLDA, wrote a letter to the school board from one of our Virginia licensed attorneys and said, we don't think so. And so, long story short, they didn't back down. And so, when you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And when you're a law firm, everything's a lawsuit. So we sued them. We sued the Franklin County School Board and took it to, as these things go, and this is a very common refrain in all of my litigation work over the last 22 years here at HSLDA. Lower courts, lower administrative agency tribunals are not really very reliable. So we sued the Franklin County School Board in Franklin County in front of a Franklin County circuit court judge who said, well, seems reasonable to me. Rubber stamped it. On a kind of a flimsy, he hung it on a chunk of law, but it was kind of flimsy. So then we asked the Supreme Court of the state of Virginia to take the case. And this was a time when I'd handed off a lot of the litigation work to Peter Kamakavivoli. He went to Richmond, and a 3-judge panel heard our request to take the case, which they granted. Then it was submitted to the full Supreme Court of Virginia, 7 judges, which didn't have oral argument until the world shut down and because of COVID. So we actually had oral argument by conference call during the middle of COVID shutdowns. And so Peter did the argument, and while I was listening to the conference call, the first sign that I thought maybe we would win during the oral argument was when the school district's attorney was presenting. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Virginia said, "So, counsel, what is it that you're going to do if you don't get this information?" And the attorney said, "Well, we'll turn him over to CPS for educational neglect, or maybe we'll prosecute them." And the Chief Justice, you couldn't see him, but you could kind of hear him shaking his head, says, "It sounds to me like a school district in need of unnecessary paperwork, not a child whose education's being neglected."
Oh, that's a great.
And it's like,
that's great.
I'm like, ka-ching. Can you see me? I'm like, I'm doing a fist pump here. And so later, then the opinion came down, and it was 7-0, kind of a no-brainer. No dissents, no concurrences. But the case itself is emblematic of there are still officials out there who think that they have a lot more authority than what they actually do. And if we hadn't, if the Sospeeds hadn't gotten, if they had just gone along, if they just went along to go along, to get along, hundreds of families in that school district would be, submitting to unlawful authority. And one of the things that Peter, when he was doing the oral argument, James Madison years ago in a famous Virginia, the Memorial and Remonstrance that he wrote about religious freedom here in Virginia, said, we should take alarm at the first exercise on our freedoms. So while the additional information itself, it would have been really easy. It would have been so easy. It's just like 2 pieces of paper. That's all they would have had to submit, a birth certificate and a light bill, basically. Not required by law, easy to comply with. They would, and by the end of before the end of the case, before they even started the case, the school district knew all the information that they wanted. They were exercising their authority and threatening prosecution because, they wanted what they wanted, and they or abusing their authority, really. But so by standing up at that very early intrusion into liberty, not only do other school districts in Virginia not follow suit, they now know, don't do that. But it also encourages, I've always said this, that the homeschooling laws of America exist so that homeschoolers know what they're legally required to do. But even more important, they exist so that officials know the boundaries of their authority. They don't have boundless authority. There are things they have to do too. And so this case reminded these officials and everybody, bigger than that homeschoolers know the law and they respect the law. They'll follow the law, but they want you to do that too. And they will make you do it if you don't do it in the first place.
Yeah, and it's good to be reminded that, when we push back against a particular county, and maybe it seems like small, it's one county amidst how many counties in the nation, but the impact of that reverberates for homeschool families across Virginia and across the nation. So, were you surprised that in this day and age, you would have a school board be so obstinate in their position? It seems to me that in the COVID era, districts would not be doing this type of thing, and yet there you were, there Peter was. So is it a shock to you that there was this level of commitment to their authority, or?
No, not shocked. So the case actually started pretty, before COVID. There was actually a preface to the case, because when they first threatened to prosecute, and we said, well, if you don't back off, we'll sue. But not only that, they turned in their paperwork. The Sospeeds had turned in their paperwork before the school district actually formally adopted its policy. And so we said, it didn't apply to them because it hadn't been passed yet. And they kind of went, oh, okay, you're right. But next year, we'll prosecute you. So then we sued them, and it took a year, it took a while, and it ended up that the argument happened in COVID, but most of the case happened before COVID. But no, it's not shocking. And that's the thing that people probably, this is a big takeaway, and you've alluded to this. Our lawyers deal with this kind of thing, big and small, frequently, all across the country. And most of the time, it's resolved quickly because, we are quite confident in our understanding of the law. We make persuasive arguments. We often do it just in a letter or a phone call. And we just had a situation in Pennsylvania where a similar thing happened, and we were confident we're right. And the school district was making demands that were contrary to law, and they answered our letter by saying, nope, we're still going to require this. And we said, well, we had a couple of back and forths, just like we did in Sospeed. And we finally, just last week, got a letter back from the school district saying, well, we don't agree with you, but we're not going to push the issue.
Kind of them. It's very, very gracious of them.
Yeah. So that kind of thing happens all the time. They just don't often make it past that stage. Even that one in Pennsylvania went farther than some, because a lot of times, like you said, extending grace to the officials, they actually don't understand. And when we explain it to them, they understand it. They just, okay, you're right. So these kind of things happen all the time. They don't always percolate up, but they frequently have. In my time here, things have made their way higher than you'd think. So it's not really that shocking.
Well, and when they do percolate up, it's important that we stand up and rise to the occasion. In fact, the last conversation I had before I came in here was with Peter about a case involving a school official who didn't accept a withdrawal notice, and next thing you knew, the family had received paperwork, a subpoena to show up for court. And so it's, this week, it's another family in another state dealing with the very same issue.
And the family had followed the law, because he talked to me about the same case. The family had followed the law meticulously.
Yep.
They were completely in compliance. And the school official, we don't know yet why, either didn't understand or, had something else going on. But the fact is, we should be able to resolve this fairly quickly, because it's a complete, misapplication of the law.
It's very straightforward. It's very straightforward.
And it happens all the time.
Yep. And so it's, just continued vigilance on all of these cases. That's part one of a two-part episode regarding seminal cases in the homeschool world and what we've done at HSLDA over 40 years. So if you've enjoyed this episode, I would encourage you to tune in for next episode as well. And you can go to homeschooltalks.com/join and become a member. I would encourage you to do so. You know, a lot of the benefits that we talked about in this episode with respect to contacting attorneys, having legal defense, getting quick access, after hours representation are available to members. And so if you're not a member, I would consider joining. I think you'll find it very worthwhile. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's legal support team. We know homeschooling isn't always easy. That's why we're committed to giving you peace of mind, so you can focus on giving your kids the best possible education. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized legal advice from our team of attorneys to help you comply with your state's homeschool law. And will represent you if your right to homeschool is ever challenged, even in court. Every day, we help our members respond to overreaching officials, and we stand ready to defend your homeschool against unlawful attacks. To hear more about how you can enjoy a worry-free homeschool experience, visit hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.